All right, welcome everybody to this morning's webinar on workforce sustainability in the modern school system, hosted by the Education Policy Institute. So I hope you're all where you intended to be. I can see plenty of people joining now as well, so I don't want to rush into things here. Get yourself settled, have a sip on a cup of tea. I think the purpose of this webinar is really to talk about how workforce could look over the coming years. There'll be no surprise to anyone on this webinar that teaching in England has been having difficulties with recruitment, with retention, with workload over the last 10 or 15 years. And it's been hard to hang on to teachers, and teachers' motivations have been falling over that time. There doesn't seem to be any obvious end in sight to that, but we do have new school structures, multi-academy trusts rising, who are centralizing their workforce using different ways of working. We have new generative AI, which a lot of people think might take some of the pressure off teachers for planning, for administration, and surveys show that vast numbers of teachers are already using tools like this. So the question today is, how can we ensure that this workforce remains sustainable and teachers remain motivated into the future in England? So this webinar presented by EPI, we are a small research institute in the UK focused on closing disadvantaged gaps in the school system to help the most disadvantaged children succeed. I'm James, I'll be hosting today. The webinar is also supported and made possible by Capita, so thank you to Caitlin for making this happen. And we have a fairly brilliant panel to discuss this. We've got Caitlin, of course, she leads market development at Capita. We've got Jim Knight, Lord Knight on your screen. He is, I always struggle with Jim's biography, but he's an education expert. He's a former schools minister and minister of several other things as well. He's a non-exec director on 4 education-related boards. Every time he tells me his CV, it goes on a lot longer than that. But the main thing you need to know is that he has been on more of these panels than you've had cooked breakfasts and has a lot to say about the future of education. We also have Julie McCulloch. She leads policy and strategy at ASCL, not far behind Jim in terms of her experience at forecasting the future of education and understanding what's going on in the sector right now. And we have Antonia Spinks. She is the CEO of the Pioneer Educational Trust. It's a multi-academy trust. She's been working in education for over 25 years, leading many schools for several years. And she has a huge amount to say about what's going on the ground right now. So I think the way this is going to work is Caitlin's going to kick off. She's going to tell us Capita's perspective on what's going on from supporting schools right now. Then you get to hear from me again with a few slides about what's going on in education, what EPI are doing. Then we're going to go through our illustrious panelists for their opening remarks to get your juices flowing there. And then we will come to you for nearly a full hour, I hope, of Q&A. So in terms of the admin that you need to know, you should chat with each other in the chat, but put your questions for the panelists in the Q&A, because chats always fill up. And the Q&A is where Helen and Ella, who are running things on the back end and actually made all this happen, where they will be looking for these questions. So as you're thinking about this, as you're listening, please do put all your questions in the Q&A. We won't lose them. We will come back to those as soon as we've come to our panelists. All right. So I think that is all of the initial niceties done. But before we kick off, we have a poll for you, because we've been talking about the possibility of these new tools, and actually we want to know what it is you think and what tools you're using right now. So I believe in the chat is going to go a poll, or it's going to pop up for you. I'm not actually entirely sure how these things happen or whether I can see it, but that's going to happen right this moment. And then we will get some live results from this. So take a moment, silent reading, and click some buttons. Okay, has everyone managed to get through all of that? Now, we are not techie enough to be able to show you immediate charts in the screen here, sorry. I wish we were, but I believe we have some results coming through from this, which I will get any moment now when everyone's clicked a button. Oh wow, 68 of you think AI tools could help. Actually, that is a lot more than I thought. I thought there'd be a lot more AI skeptics out here today, but more than 2/3 of you thinking AI tools would actually help with teacher workload. Well, you are in the right place, actually, to hear more about that. So I suppose let's first up go to Caitlin then and hear what she has to say. And then I think I will come back with a couple more results from this poll after Caitlin. Caitlin, away you say, go.
Thanks very much, James. So good morning, everybody. So I'm Caitlin Bell. I head up market development into the education sector for Capita. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining our webinar today on workforce sustainability in the modern school system. I'm personally really delighted to be able to represent Capita and also our wonderful partnership with the EPI, who are doing fantastic work to advance education through rigorous data analysis, research and sharing of knowledge. So at Capita, we deliver practical solutions to support people, place and productivity in the public sector, so public sector wide, although I focus obviously within education. And of course, today we're speaking about the people aspect of that, the education workforce. So as you'll know, and I really probably don't need to tell anyone on this call this, access to high quality teaching is the single biggest lever for schools to have for being able to improve educational outcomes, particularly for children and pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds. However, as James has already mentioned, recruitment and retention is a really significant concern. Whilst there are some glimmers of hope in the latest statistics, with more teachers returning to the profession and fewer leaving, this is very much still remains a targeted area for action. So webinars such as this and the work we've done with EPI on the Effective Schools Groups tool, and more on that from James to come, are vital to understanding the issues and the levers of control, providing invaluable insights and data that can help us collectively understand address challenges faced by schools. So also worth mentioning actually that the recently launched Foundation for Education Development report named Education at Crossroads, Shaping a System that Works for Everyone, to which Capita has also been an enthusiastic contributor, with many across the education sector voicing their suggestions, their insights, really also does focus on workforce. So one of the three key chapters being on workforce specifically. And in that they note this workforce strategy for the future must begin with listening to those within the profession, which is what obviously we're doing here today. So that report really is worth a read on the Fed website if you haven't already. So it's clear really from obviously everything that EPI is doing and others within the sector that the future of education rests on the strength of its workforce and the collaborative action of those within the sector. So that's everyone from policy, government, industry, technology. So basically lots of us on this call to turn the awareness of these issues into solutions. So today's webinar, as James has mentioned, will delve into the topics and more, offering insights from experts in the field and practical examples of successful initiatives. We'll explore the challenges and opportunities and discuss how we can collectively support the educators who play the vital role of shaping the future of our society. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. I'm really looking forward to it, and your participation and engagement are vital as we work together to support, build, grow a sustainable and thriving education workforce. Thanks. I'll hand back to you, James.
Thanks so much, Kayla. I really should have let you do the intro there. That was a lot more organized and clearer than what I managed. Okay, so I think now what we're going to do is actually just have a look at a little bit of that work that you have helped support, Caitlin, that EPI has been doing to look at the school workforce. So Ella's going to pop up a few slides here for you that I'm just going to briefly talk through. And I think whenever you're doing this sort of scene setting, it's really helpful to start with what's going on with pupils, because I was at a discussion the other day where someone said to me, is there really a problem with the workforce at all? Don't we know that pupils have done absolutely fine in England? And since pupils are doing okay, is there really an issue? And the answer, of course, is that pupils are not all doing fine. Some pupils have done really well, but not all pupils. And those pupil outcomes that have worsened during the course of the pandemic have also spread, so that disadvantaged pupils, pupils who had lower attainment before the pandemic, are doing worse than they were previously. And on the next slide, we can see a little bit of a chart of this. I think this is what we always need to be coming back to and focusing on, is how are the pupils doing? Because in the end, that's why our education system exists. And what we know is that pupils have not done exceptionally well. In fact, disadvantage gaps, so these are the gaps between pupils who are more affluent and pupils who are less affluent in their attainment, those have been opening over the last 15 years, and they have opened even wider through the pandemic and since it. And that gap has not closed. So what you can see in this chart in the red line is that the early years foundation stage, there is already a 4 to 5 month gap between pupils who are more and less affluent. By the time you get to Key Stage 2, that's doubled. By the time you get to Key Stage 4, that is quadrupled. So pupils are not necessarily doing just fine, as this person proposed to me. Obviously, I won't name them because I'm being so rude about them here, but you know, a lot of pupils are really struggling, particularly since the pandemic. And undoubtedly, because as we know, as the OECD keeps telling us, nothing matters more than the workforce, it may well be that there are differences in the workforce between the schools that serve more challenging pupils and more affluent pupils that are leading to some of this difference. So I think on the next slide, we can see that EPI did a recent report looking at this gap. What is the workforce looking like in more affluent schools and more disadvantaged schools? And is there a difference there? And the answer is, you may be unsurprised to hear, I think this is well known, yes, there is a difference. It's a substantial and persistent difference in teachers' experience, in their expertise, in how long they stick around. So I'd say that's probably like their motivation between these high and low disadvantage schools. And the next slide, we show you just a few charts of that. Now, I've been whipping through these so far, but I'm going to pause a little bit because there's obviously lines everywhere. And I know that when you've made the chart, it's very easy to just talk about it blithely, but actually it takes a little while to read. So what are you looking at here? What we're looking at is a chart of teachers' experience. There are 8 panels there. 1 column for primary schools, 1 column for secondary schools, and rows for levels of seniority in the school, from head teachers down to classroom teachers. You can see how those gaps have opened over time. The dotted line shows the average level of teaching experience since qualification in the 20% most disadvantaged schools, and the solid line shows the experience in the 20% of most affluent schools. And I think 2 things are clear here. First of all, there is a huge gap there, and it's a persistent gap over a long period. And secondly, that gap is getting wider in secondary schools. Not so much in primary schools, where it's stayed stable, or you might even say closed slightly in some places over the last decade, but in secondary schools, it is growing, particularly for head teachers. The amount of experience that your secondary head teacher has in a very disadvantaged school has fallen dramatically over the last 15 years, whereas in the most affluent schools, it's only fallen slightly. And that's something that should concern us, because leadership is critical. The experience of your teachers really matters for how good they are controlling the classroom and making a difference for pupils. So if we go on to the next slide, we can see that these sorts of gaps between affluent and disadvantaged schools in their workforce, it's not just about experience, it's about expertise and about motivation too. So your top chart there shows the proportion of lessons taught by people who have a degree in the subject that they're teaching, or a related degree in the subject they're teaching. And you can see that while that rose for a while, it's been falling over the last decade, but particularly you can see that in the most disadvantaged schools, there is this large and persistent gap, again, relative to more affluent schools. And I think we sort of take these things for granted. We think to ourselves, oh, well, of course there is. But there's no reason that it should be the case that this happens. There's no reason that we couldn't put in place incentives and mechanisms to encourage experienced teachers, to encourage the most expert teachers to teach where they can make the greatest difference to the pupils who are struggling the most. So this is not the sort of thing that I think we should accept as some sort of law of nature. This is the sort of thing that policy and what we do day to day can actually influence. And then the bottom chart there shows the rate of turnover. And you can see there again, disadvantaged schools have much higher teacher turnover, but it's particularly in secondary schools. So this is where a lot of the problems are in secondary schools. And one of the questions we'll have for our panelists, I think, is why is it in secondary schools that we're struggling and not in primary schools, and what can we learn from that? All right, so moving on to the next slide now. We also dug a bit deeper than this, because obviously the national numbers, and we built a tool that Caitlin talked about to look at what's going on in individual school groups and academy trusts. And on the next slide, you can see we assessed those across 4 domains. So we looked at the workforce, but we also looked at pupil inclusion, at their outcomes, and at financial efficiency. Outcomes are obviously commonly looked at, but I think inclusion sometimes less so, because you can have great outcomes for some pupils, but not for others. And that's something we wanted to make sure we were capturing when we were assessing which of these school groups are doing a really effective job. On the next slide, you can see the exact measures that we use for this. And this is developing all the time. We're actively working on this tool. And you can find a link to this if you want to see it in the chat where Helen's popped it up, I think. So you can go play with this yourself. We've got all these measures. I'm not going to go through all the details, but measures of inclusion, which relate to how much you're suspending pupils, how absent they are, how much off-rolling there is, how likely you are to admit pupils who have free school meals or special educational needs, then typical outcome measures, workforce measures, some of which I've just talked about in more detail, and financial measures, because obviously you need to be staying afloat. And then we put all these together to help assess how it is that these school groups are doing, which you can look at on our website. And on the next slide, we've got a quick example of how that looks. So this is the sort of thing you'll find if you click through to this. A radar chart showing where groups have strengths and weaknesses, and you can compare different groups there. So you can see that there's no such thing as one school group that is just better. They are better or weaker on various different measures, and there are always trade-offs in doing that. I guess that's something we're going to talk about today, is where we should be focusing our efforts, and you can compare different school groups here. So on the next slide, we'll say that actually what we're doing is, we're still building on this. So we've built this tool. You can go play with it now. And thank you to Caitlin for helping with this. And what we're doing next is joining this up with a whole lot of survey data to try to understand what it is that's going on in multi-academy trust. Why is it that some are doing better than others on some measures? And workforce management is one of those things we've been looking at. And you can see here that initial results, which show that even though huge numbers of MAT teams are doing finance, fewer are involved in workforce planning and deployment. So I suppose there's a question about whether there's an opportunity there for them to do more to improve the effectiveness of workforce deployment and management across their trusts, rather than leaving that to individual schools. But also you can see in the second point that different trusts of different sizes seem to manage their workforce a bit differently, have different rates of turnover, have different rates of retention of their teachers in their schools. And so there's a question about why that is and what we might do about it if it's a problem. So that poses, I think, a few questions, and to answer them, we have wonderful panelists. So I'm not going to go do any more talking here. I hope that was an interesting whip through some of the work that EPI has been doing on this, but to help us understand what's going on and what we might do about it, I think we're going to first turn to Jim.
Hello, thanks, James. I was doing exactly what you told me not to do, which is play around with the tool, which is great. So look, I think we spend a lot of time when we're thinking about teacher retention, thinking more about extrinsic than intrinsic motivation, and particularly in the context of the Multi-Academy Trust that I chair, which is EACT, which I think even according to the tool, has particularly high levels of disadvantage. We worry quite a lot about the advantage gap, and we worry quite a lot about how we attract great teachers and develop great teachers. And I think that latter point is also important. So, pay is important, that extrinsic motivation, and having decent staff rooms is important. Looking after our people is important. All of those extrinsic things, and helping them manage workload. And undoubtedly, as we get better at using AI tools, and as those AI tools are developed more specifically for education, rather than us using general AI tools for general adults, that will get better and better. But what I see from the work that we do at EACT, I also do some work with the most valuable school group in the world, Nord Anglia. They have just over 90 schools all over the world. And in both cases, actually, the evidence is pretty clear that if you work hard on developing your teachers, the evidence from Nord Anglia is really clear that there's a really strong link with those who are involved in research, have a much higher retention rate. Those that are being developed through professional development, particularly if that professional development is around, it engages with the purpose of teaching and engages with a more collective vision of classroom practice, then that really improves retention and raises quality. And to me, that speaks to the vocation of teaching, which, when you're thinking about the advantage gap and how do we attract teachers into the more disadvantaged places, I don't think there's any other game in town. I don't think in the end it comes down to pay. I think it comes down to the huge satisfaction that you can get in transforming the life chances of children who've got the biggest barriers. And if we don't lean into that in terms of how we nurture teachers, how we develop them, how we talk about them, how we trust them, then I don't think we're going to get anywhere. And in my head, that's right at the core of it.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jim. Julie.
Thanks, James. I agree with much of what Jim has said there. I might, as a representative of a union, have a slightly different view on pay, but I certainly agree on the importance of professional development and all the rest of that. So the whole question about workforce sustainability, it's something that at ASCL we've been doing a lot of thinking and talking about at the moment. It's also a key question we've been asking as part of a project that we're running at the moment, which we're somewhat grandiosely calling Schools and Colleges of the Future. What that's doing is it's asking three questions. It's looking at what should schools and colleges be responsible for, how can they be resourced to deliver on those responsibilities, and then crucially to this discussion, how can we attract and retain the best people to work in them. So I thought in my opening remarks I might just reflect a little bit on what we're hearing as part of that project that's relevant to this discussion. So it really grew out that project of the very, very clear message we've been getting from our members that schools and colleges are increasingly being expected to expand their remit to provide support services to pupils and families which go far beyond teaching and learning, and that most are finding it more and more difficult to recruit staff at all levels, and the fact that those two problems are not unrelated. So there's loads of evidence. EPI's got loads of this evidence. I'm just going to cite a couple of other examples for that relationship between the expanding expectations on schools and the problems of recruitment and retention. So there was a survey done recently in the northwest of England by Action for Children, where teachers talk really powerfully about how they have to go beyond their remit to provide emotional family support, essentials like food and clothing, and the way that was both hindering their ability to teach and taking an emotional toll on top of their already heavy workloads. The DFE does an annual survey they call the Working Lives of Teachers and Leaders that consistently lists high workload and stress or poor well-being as the top two reasons why teachers and leaders are either actually leaving or considering leaving the profession. And then there's work that's been coming as well from NFER, which paints a really similar picture, with teachers consistently reporting that pupil behaviour is driving higher workload and citing more support from outside agencies for specific pupil needs like SEND support, mental health or well-being, excuse me, is key to workload reduction. And as I say, James, you've done loads of work on this at EPI as well. So there's all of that going on. There's also the kind of points of comparison with other industries and professions, which we might get into later, and how teaching can compete with the increasing flexibility that certainly new graduates and also people across the workforce can find in other industries. So I think that might be something to come back to. So just to kind of finish my initial thoughts, that work that we've been doing around schools and colleges of the future, there'll be a whole range of recommendations coming out of that. Some of them will be kind of big picture stuff, so looking at how is the government's child poverty strategy going to impact on these kind of expanding expectations of schools, the need to reinvest properly in wider children's services, all of that. But there will also be some much more specific recommendations around the workforce itself. So things like looking at how we raise the status of the teaching profession, how we reduce administrative burdens on staff, how we can start to embed more flexible working practices, which I know are often quite challenging in schools, but there are some really interesting examples of that happening. Looking at issues around workforce diversity and looking at the pipelines through the profession and into leadership. So I'm really happy to go into more detail on any of that later if you'd like me to, but I'll leave it there for now.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Julie. And I have no problem with all the fantastic work that all of the other researchers in education are doing at all. They're very sensitive of you, though. Thank you. Yeah, I think Jack's and the DFE's work are just wonderful on this stuff, and I think you make such an important point about the other pressures on schools and whether actually what teachers or school staff really actually, let's not forget that half of school staff are not teachers, are expected to do these days. Now we're going to go to Antonia in just a moment, but I'm going to remind you that then we're going to come to Q&A. So do put your questions in the Q&A. I can see a couple of questions in there already that we'll come to with our panelists. If you're putting them in the chat, we're probably not going to see them, just because managing the Q&A, everything else like that is a bit much. So we're going to look at the Q&A there. So do put questions in there while Antonia is talking. Antonia, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I completely agree with what's been proffered already by Jim and by Julie. Julie has made a number of the points that I was going to make about the wider work around schools and the impact that has on managing workload. But as you said at the beginning, James, I'm here to talk about what's going on the ground. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit about what we're doing at Pioneer Educational Trust around some of these areas in terms of recruitment, retention, workforce management, etc. So for us, for me, I think that retention of staff is the most important bit rather than the recruitment part of it. We need to retain high quality and experienced staff within the profession in order to be able to continue to deliver that the education that we know that the pupils deserve. And just talking to all of the points that you made, James, in terms of the research being done there about the level of experience that we must retain within our profession. So for us, we've worked really hard on our people strategy, and we've got a number of strands to that people strategy. So we have our pioneering people strand of that, which is around the recruitment, but also about the culture and leadership and how all of those kind of pieces work, to create an inclusive, welcoming, diverse workforce. We've got our pathways, which I think talks to Jim's point all around how you develop your workforce and make sure that every single member of your workforce is developed, not just the teachers, but every single member of your workforce is invested in and developed. And the third strand of our people strategy is around our Pioneer promises. Now, these are our commitments to staff around manageable workload and well-being as well, and again talks to some of the points that Jim's raised. So we very much want people's well-being to be focused on the well-being that comes from a job well done. So how can we create the conditions to make sure that people are enabled to do a really good job that they do? So we've got 10 kind of promises for our staff. One of those promises is about flexible working. So hopefully picking up on some of the things that Julie's been saying around flexible working. We worked back in 2019 Staff said that they wanted us in an engagement survey to look at greater workplace flexibilities. I had no idea where to start. We worked with Flexible Teacher Talent and some other groups through Department for Education project that was happening at the time, and really thought carefully about how we can embrace flexible working within schools. Understanding it doesn't feel intuitive, understanding that you operationally need to run your schools and your trusts, as well as offering flexible working. And so, you know, we researched, looked into it, and, you know, have a flexible working strategy that we have been implementing since 2020, with very much, again, a focus on diversity and equalities. I think that flexible working is an absolute diversity and equity imperative around all of those things. And so we've implemented that work, and since then have been working with Capita over the past couple of years as one of the Department for Education's flexible working ambassadors. We represent the South East region. We know through the evaluations that we've taken from staff that having our approach to flexible working has left them feeling valued, supported, trusted, and improved work-life balance by offering small flexibilities that don't impact on their pay or our budgets, for example. And just to talk to one of the other themes that we're obviously exploring here, which is around the use of technology. Within that, obviously, there's a role for technology and flexible working in terms of where, when, and how we work, and balancing the need between the relationships and the collaborations, because I actually think that what we've seen in the business world is people bringing people back into the office, because there is such richness to be had from in-person collaborations, being part of a team, being face to face with people at the same time as being flexible in different ways. So I think that there's definitely a role for technology within better meeting individuals' needs and control over their lives. I do see the technology and the AI as a bit of a double-edged sword. There's not a day that goes by that I don't use AI in my role. At the same time, is that leading to reduced workload? I'm not sure, because sometimes we replace the efficiencies in one area with additional working in another area. And we only have to look at the invention of the washing machine and the Hoover as examples of how those things were introduced to reduce people's to increase their efficiencies, and all we've done is replace it with other stuff. So I think that there's something to be said definitely about technology and AI, but I'm also nervously cautious about it, because I also think that there's no separation between work and home, and the impact that that has on people's well-being. I think it cannot be underestimated either, in terms of their feeling of workload, overwhelm, burnout, all of those kind of bits and pieces. So, you know, I think retention is incredibly important for all the reasons that you said, James. The importance of thinking about your workforce management within that. Big advocate for flexible working within schools and trusts, and there are very practical and straightforward ways to do that and make it very healthy, and obviously the role that technology plays in that as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Antonia. So that is all our panelists. We've heard some opening remarks. We now have a deluge of questions in the Q&A. And I think we've also closed the poll. So I have more results from that. So 2/3 of you thought AI tools could support teachers and increase retention. Surprisingly, only 5% of you said, no, you don't think it will help. So that is remarkable optimism among the many people on this call. Half of you have used it already, and 1/3 of your schools already have a policy on AI usage. So obviously things are moving really fast, and I think that's reflected in a lot of the questions. While our panelists have talked a lot about the wider role of schools, which in many ways is a very human endeavour for teachers and staff to be helping their pupils in person, we have a lot of questions about that AI. So I want to come back to that wider role later and ask how we bring these things together. But let's first turn to many of these questions about how we actually implement this in schools. We've got questions here about how you combine, how you ban mobile phones when you're expecting a lot of digital learning and AI in classrooms. We've got questions about how staff should learn to do these things effectively, and whether CPD is aligned with new technologies, how teachers and middle leaders can use it to reduce their workload, what are the practical things that should be done, and whether staff should be required to declare whether they're using AI, and some school policies actually dissuade us from using it. So I think it's a cluster of questions that I'd love to get panelists' views on. And I'm sure all the panelists will have a view on this, probably from quite different perspectives. So rather than focusing you on a single one, maybe I'll let the panelists pick which aspect of this, using AI, how do you do it effectively? How do you teach school leaders and classroom teachers to do it, and how do you construct policies around it to maximize its use? To the panelists, should we go back through in the order we've done it before, since Caitlin, you haven't said something for quite a long time there, so why don't we turn to you first, since you're actually supporting schools in doing this?
Yeah, so no, very, very interesting questions. It's amazing actually to see the amount coming up on the screen regarding AI. And I think really from kind of business perspective, it's really interesting to actually sit and listen to those living and breathing it day in, day out, and taking that knowledge basically to then look at the solutions that we're able to shape and service we're able to deliver. So I'm very much enjoying this conversation. I'm very much interested in this. And from an AI perspective, we're doing a lot in Capita. You may well have seen in the news in terms of kind of big changes with regards to AI, particularly actually around recruitment. So we're looking at how you can recruit en masse using people, obviously, but with an AI agent in the loop. So ultimately getting that ability to hire people in a lot quicker. I think it reduces the time by about 25%, being able to get someone through the door and then into workplace. And actually what I'm interested in is actually how can we use that tool potentially to solve some of the issues we're facing in recruiting teachers? And that's very much a kind of, as I said, recruitment en masse rather than necessarily bespoke. But I'm very intrigued to hear kind of what the other panelists have to say in terms of actually the difficulties around recruiting teachers, where they would see AI being able to manage that. And obviously then there's the other element of AI of actually how is it being used in the classrooms, which obviously we know that schools are using it. I mean, I was speaking to someone the other day, as young as 6 and younger, using AI as at home in their daily lives. And I mean, how do you even begin to regulate that? How do you even begin to use that for the best way possible in terms of learning? And I don't have the answers to that, but very interested to hear from my colleagues on the panel in terms of that recruitment element, and also more that on the ground, how you're managing to use the tools of AI.
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. And 25% is a huge change.
Yeah, it's significant. I think it was only launched over the last couple of weeks in terms of the kind of being a public talking about it. But it's moving at such a fast and rapid pace, and being able to have kind of live agents working alongside humans to be able for then the people to be able to do that qualitative assessment of someone, but based on much more data and much more insights. And again, actually from a retention perspective, being able to look at the data and the insights that are coming through the kind of the recruitment process, and actually start to be able to assess, is this a candidate that is likely to want to stay in this profession? So I think watch this space in that space. But I just think, yeah, really, really interesting things that are moving quite quickly.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, Jim, I know you are a tech optimist and futurist. What do you think is coming down the line? How should we cope?
James, I'm also a tech regulator. So, when I speak in Parliament, I speak quite a lot about the bad things that big tech are doing rather than the good things. So there is a balance. But I do chair Century Tech, which is an AI in education platform. So, I should declare that interest. I do have my biases, as does the AI, one of the many ethical things that we all have to look out for. Look, there are so many good questions here. I'll rattle through what I can very quickly. On phone bans, we debated this in the House of Lords this week, and those advocating for an outright ban across all schools are saying you can use tablets and PCs and have people log into their social media platforms to teach them media literacy. There's nothing that you can't do with school tech that mean you have to have phones. I personally think it would be a mistake to make it illegal for schools to allow phones in. I think there are some circumstances where educationally you might want to use these devices, and as AI rolls out, I think those possibilities will only increase. So an outright legal ban, I think, is a mistake. On workload, we talked about flexible working. One of the great uses of AI is in timetabling. So you can add so many more different variables into the timetabling calculation, which is one of the most complex maths problems that humanity has yet devised. And AI is a perfect thing to really help add flexibility into the timetable, but data analysis, recruitment, managing the energy efficiency across the estate, potentially some workforce remodeling that can be done using AI tools to take some workload away. There's lots that can be done there that should be explored by leaders. I think we will become better users of it. So when it comes to, I think Martin's question about declaring usage of it, I think we'll move away from that, because we'll stop using it like search, where we just put in and then maybe have a bit of a conversation, but we're kind of, the more sophisticated usage, I would suggest, will come when we start to upload documents, when we start to train the AIs ourselves, and then we're using it at a higher level. We're not relying on it for the data that it has itself, hoarded from across the internet. We're doing a lot more of the training, and we're using the technology as technology rather than as this sort of huge encyclopedia or whatever. I think it's really, really important for schools to have a policy. If a third have a policy, what are the other 2/3 doing? I mean, I'm not saying you've got to implement AI in a hurry, but you've got to have a policy about it, because if you've got individual teachers, increasingly many more of them using it, if they're using free AI tools, which if they're using it as an individual, they probably are, the data protection issues, some of the other ethical issues attached to that are really problematic. And so you have to have a policy. And there are organizations like the Good Futures Foundation, Educate Ventures, I'm on the board of both of those, who offer things, and there are others available who will help you put those policies together. Two final things, James. Obviously, part of that policy will start to be training the workforce in how to use some of these things. Crucial within that is critical thinking about how the AI works, understanding the business models of it, understanding the ethical issues around it. Ultimately, we'll also have to up our game in teaching critical thinking to students. They are all using it far more prevalently than we are as adults. And if we, in this age of disinformation that's only getting worse, it's not getting better, it's going to be a challenge to find truth in amongst the garbage as things roll on. We have to be doing much better at teaching critical thinking. So we should start with upping our game as teachers, and then move on to students. And finally, Nicola's question about losing expertise, I think is an important one, but the evidence that I've seen suggests that this is a real problem for those people who are essentially less well educated. So this could reinforce the disadvantage gap. If you use the tools at a higher level, then it actually improves your creativity and it improves your learning. But if you use it by leaning on it to rely on it to give you all the answers, then you've got a problem. And there are one or two AI tools. I think Claude is one of them. Their education tool answers questions with a question. So it's stimulating curiosity. And you should look around and find the tools that are really going to work for you educationally, rather than just going for the big brands that everybody else is using, which in the end are probably designed for adults. They're not safe for children, and there may well be issues attached to all of that.
Thanks so much, Jim. Can I just ask you one thing about the policies? I think policies are, on the one hand, incredibly boring, on the other hand, incredibly important. Policies can put a straitjacket on teachers' use of new technology, or they can enable them to safely explore it. And I suppose the concern is that some schools have more resources and are more able to provide the support to teachers to have bespoke platforms and education platforms that allow them to explore safely, whereas schools with fewer resources may not have that opportunity because they can't afford that tech, and their policies will simply ban it. Are we going to end up exacerbating gaps if schools start to clamp down?
There is a real danger of that, James, and I think it's incumbent on all of us. We're taking money, public money, all of us who are working in MATs and in other maintained schools, etc. And I think our obligation is to share. This comes from a common pot, this resource. And yes, the larger MAT may well, if they've got any sense, they may well be developing their own large language models that they will train with trusted data sources. And I know some of the other educational businesses in the landscape are doing the same. I hope that they don't keep that proprietorially because they have a competitive mindset. I hope that they want to share that, and they want to share their policies and share this across the profession, so that we're building the quality and the standards across the profession. Because in the end, we're not only we all funded from the same pot, but we've all got the same motivation. We all want to do the best by the largest number of children.
Thank you. Julie.
Yeah, thanks, James. So I'll try to kind of build on some of those points, I think, rather than repeat any of them, because I think, as ever, loads of really helpful stuff there from Jim. I mean, I think I agree. The question about phones, I think, is a bit of a red herring in a number of ways. I think partly, as Jim said, there's a whole range of other devices that are available in most schools to kind of to support digital learning, but also, kind of our frustration really about the conversation about phones is often about there's so much focus on phones in schools, where actually the vast majority of schools already have a really robust policy on phone use, and it's almost none. The real concerns are in what children and young people are accessing on those devices outside of schools. So I'll get off that soapbox, but I think that's the bigger issue. I think, to pick up on some of the questions around professional development and the use of AI to reduce workload. I mean, I absolutely agree. Can't remember who asked the question there, but there was a question around, should CPD be aligning more with technological developments, and particularly the MPQs? Actually, should we be looking at that more in the MPQs? I mean, and an emphatic yes from me. Really pleased that the MPQs are being reviewed at the moment. I think for all sorts of reasons that there are aspects of those qualifications that need to be updated and changed. At the moment, what we hear from our members is they're often quite theoretical. They're very focused on pedagogy. All of that's obviously really important, but there's an awful lot more to running a school as well. And so more kind of thinking about the practical aspects of school leadership and rolling kind of technology and AI into that, I think would be very welcome. So we're kind of pleased to see that direction of travel, I think, and there's more I think we can all do to encourage that. And I think the use of AI to reduce workload, in some ways that feels a bit reductive when you're thinking about, a technology with the sort of potential that AI has. But I also think it's really important, when we're looking at where I started in this, about how can we make the job as it is at the moment, or the jobs in our schools, more manageable. I think anything that has the potential actually immediately to reduce some of that administrative burden on staff at all sorts of different levels is really welcome. And I think what we are collectively as a society not as good at as we could be is that question of, where do we think the technology really plays an important role, and we can kind of wholesale move over to that, and where actually what aspects of learning and education and supporting children and young people need to continue to be human-led, and we absolutely need to kind of keep AI at the door there. And I think if we're looking at it from that perspective of how do we focus it on the former there, on the things that it's really, really good at and humans are much less good at, then I think that could be really powerful. So yeah, that focus on non-teaching tasks, freeing up teachers to do what they do best and to do what really does need to be human-led. I think that's where I would really like to see the debate going in the short term, alongside those much bigger questions about the potential of AI for teaching and learning more broadly in the future.
Thanks, Stuart. And how do you think that should happen? Who should be doing this? Do we need the government to swoop in with another workload reduction toolkit that has AI integrated? Should it, as Jim said, be some of these MATs who have more resources in central offices developing these things? I know that's only part of your view, Jim, but I think you mentioned that before. Or are there other places? Do we want to distribute this and allow schools to really figure it out for themselves?
I think it needs to happen at all levels. So I listened to a really interesting talk by Michael Fullan at the weekend, where he was talking about the importance of bottom-up change, and that frankly, the only effective changes we've ever really seen have been bottom up and then have been kind of embraced by policymakers, which I thought was an interesting perspective. So, certainly on this, there is so much interesting work going on across the system that it would be crazy for us not to be finding ways to surface that and to share it. But I do have some concerns, and I think Jim alluded to this a bit about, this is a new frontier. There are lots of ethical questions here for individual people working in schools and for those organisations as a whole. And it worries me a little bit that we're leaving too much of that to individual schools and trusts to navigate, where actually I think a bit more clarity and a bit more steer and a bit more protection from government for people navigating these very interesting and challenging new areas, I think would be welcome as well.
Yes, the default in all these tools is decided by the company providing it, whose default is give us all your data and we'll use it for everything we want, ideally, isn't it? Yeah. Antonia, you're actually dealing with this day to day. How are you finding it?
Yeah, we're grappling with it, I think, is the big answer to that. I think I've got more questions and answers, like many of the indeed now way through it. I completely agree with the point that you just made around ethics, because I think that sometimes we think about ethics after the event when we should be thinking about ethics first, with all of these things, and starting from that perspective. On the phones thing, I think from somebody on the ground, parents want their children to have a phone with them because they want to know where they are for their own safety. So I think that there's a real interesting question there about we not putting in place policies that parents will undermine, because parents want to make sure that their children are safe, and they do that through the apps on their phones and all of those kind of bits and pieces. But I think linked to that, I think the technology is going to be there. Children and the young people are going to be using the technology. So I think what's incumbent on us is to teach the responsible use of technology, and that's the role that we need to play in terms of teaching responsible use of it, so that they're using it for the right reasons, they're using it educationally, they're using it socially, but in the responsible and right way. And I think that there is something there that talks to what you were saying about whose responsibility it is, because I do think that there's something around the importance of us teaching pupils the digital skills that they're going to need for the future. And I know that there's great work going on by individual schools, going on by multi-academy trusts, looking at the digital skills of the future. But I actually think that that's somewhere where the government could get involved in terms of getting the best thinkers around this to be coming up with what the digital skills that are going to be needed for the future are going to be. Because with the best will in the world, we can call on people, but really getting the best thinkers who know what digital is going to look like in 10, 20, 30 years around the table and saying, what does this mean in terms of the curriculum that we need to deliver within schools around digital skills, I think would be something that would be from both an efficiency point of view, but also in terms of its quality, better led centrally, to support schools in our work around that. Thinking about the workload piece of that, think about the workload piece of it, I think that what AI holds the potential for is a different quality of work. So rather than processing pupils' data and using technology to input data, I think that the speed with which the AI can use the data or do the processing part of that can also support us in doing more quality work with it. So more analytical work with it, more data analysis, more exploration of what will, how to make those differences, what can we improve upon, etc. So I think that where AI has real potential is taking us from the processing kind of side of the data to the analytical side of the data that we have as well. I think that there's a fundamental question about what the purpose of education is underpinning all of this. There are lots and lots of online platforms that will teach certain content to pupils. So maths, science, other subjects. There is an online platform that you could find for any subject that could teach and explain to pupils. So if we're thinking about the pedagogy and the process of teaching, the explanation part we as teachers do repetitively over time. So we teach the same lesson one year to the next class the following year. But there's a role, you know, there's so many platforms out there that actually do the teaching, the explanation part for us. So they teach how to do quadratic equations, they teach about atoms, they might teach about whatever element of the curriculum it might be. So I think that there's a question there about what the purpose of our education is and what pedagogy we need, and how we can use technology potentially for that explanation part, and then thinking, what does that mean in terms of the modelling, the scaffolding, the deliberate practice, the peer assessment, the assessment for learning, all of those kind of elements I think come in there. The online platforms that have the potential to be even more inclusive, they're very responsive, they complete an activity and then they'll say, right, you didn't do so well here, so I'll generate you some new questions on the same theme. For people, you know, from an inclusion perspective, for people with particular additional needs or whatever it might be, the ability to go back and re-watch the same content again and again and again, I think is driving and has the potential to drive inclusion. But what does that mean, therefore, for what we do within the classroom? When pupils can be taught a full curriculum online, what's the role for us within the curriculum? So I think that there's a more fundamental question in terms of workload and, you know, what we do in terms of our pedagogy and where that come from. And I think just going back to the point that both Jim and Julie have already made, think about that, you know, fantastic book, The 100-Year Life. The technology is there, so we do, and this goes to some of the comments I know in the question and answer as well. I think the skills that we need to be teaching are around creativity, problem solving, sociable relationships, all of those kind of bits and pieces. So I think that AI is almost forcing us to rethink what the purpose of education is and how we deliver that education, when there are ways and means to deliver elements of what we do in a different way through technological solutions.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Antonia. So much to mull on there. And of course, as a lifetime data analyst myself, I'm very nervous about AI taking away my job. So I think now we have a lot more questions here about AI, but I think maybe let's move to think more about the workforce more generally and the human element of this. I know we've got a number of questions here from Ashley, from John, and from some anonymous attendees asking about how we use the limited resources we have to make the most of the teachers we have. And a few I'll highlight. One asking about whether these MATs with all their resources are have the ability to do so much more than maintained schools do because of their central HR teams, and how we think about that when they're providing all of that support to schools that maintained schools might not. Another question from John about whether it's right to direct resources away from advantaged schools and what that'll mean if there are only a limited number of very expert or specialist teachers. I think that's kind of directed at me, but I'm going to throw it to you anyway. And then another about how we maximize the use of these limited specialist teachers we have in subjects like physics and modern foreign languages, where it's extremely hard to find enough teachers, and almost certainly we won't have enough specialist teachers. So how across the system and across schools do we maximize the use of those? So I think a bunch of questions really about the trade-offs there across the school system and within schools in how we make the most of the teachers we have, not the teachers we wished we did have in these specialist subjects. Yeah, why don't we start this time with Antonia, since you're probably dealing with these things a lot day to day and the deployment of these resources, and then go the other way through the panel.
Okay, so I agree with the comment that was made around the resourcing and the distribution of resources from an equity point of view. There is an argument, obviously, to say that schools with high levels of disadvantaged pupils, I don't like that phrase, but let's just go with it, or pupils with special educational needs do get additional monies because of the pupil premium and also because of the SEND funding that comes in. However, I'm not sure that the pupil premium is a premium. I think that it's, supplements already underfunded resources within schools, and I also don't believe that the SEND funding, we know there's a huge high needs deficit, and I would argue that the money that comes into school, even regardless of that deficit of the high needs, doesn't scratch the surface of the provision that needs to be put in place for a lot of our vulnerable learners within our settings. So I think it's a very, very difficult challenge that government face. And I think it's a very, very difficult challenge that obviously, schools face as well. So I do fundamentally believe that one of the challenges, and I think that Julie spoke about this right at the beginning, is that what happens for children before they start school, I think is making schools' jobs incredibly difficult. So where there's talk about us teaching children to brush their teeth, for example, that's something that should be supported by wider services when the children are very, very small. And what we're finding in our schools is children starting that haven't met their 2-year, 3-year milestones, starting at in reception year, or we've got nursery, so starting in nursery, having not met those milestones, and therefore, especially with the Key Stage 2 SATs exams being so challenging, truncating those kind of like primary years and putting additional pressures, especially where there may be communities that are less advantaged than others, serving those schools. So I think that there is something there definitely around what is the resource that can be put in preschool to mean that schools are starting from the same starting point that they may have done historically, because I think that there has been a demonstrable shift through my career, and certainly over the past 5 years, in terms of how well the milestones and when they're being met around those things. I think that the point around maintained schools and MATs is a very interesting question, and I think that schools can be well led and managed or poorly led and managed. I think MATs can be well led and managed or poorly led and managed. So I think that the point there is around leadership. And I know that there are a number of questions around the NPQ frameworks and whether the NPQs are fit for purpose in terms of, developing the leaders that we need within our schools. We certainly, as a trust, use the NPQs for our colleagues. I think that they provide vital, what we call horizontal leadership development, in that it gives them the skills to do a specific job. What we do within our trust is we have leadership, we develop all of our staff, not just teachers, every single member of staff, but teaching assistants, receptionists, in vertical leadership principles, which is how that they can demonstrate leadership capacity, competencies, I guess, that are irrespective of whatever role that they are fulfilling. So looking at the research from the Centre of Creative Leadership, for example, around vertical leadership. So I think that there's I think that the NPQs do a reasonable job of the horizontal development, but I think that there's something else that needs to go alongside that, which isn't about the knowledge of how to do a specific job, but actually how do we lead, and how do we lead well, and how do we lead inclusive schools, how do we lead diverse communities. And there was an incredibly important question put in the question and answer there around the diversity of leaders within our schools, and the NFER's research talks about that. So I won't go into the detail of why that's the case, but it's absolutely something that we must address within our sector. And just to go back to the MAT and maintain thing, I often explore that through the flexible working work that we do, because we support both maintained schools and multi-academy trusts. And I have found a small divide there in terms of what maintained schools are able to do with outsourced local authority support, as opposed to HR teams within those multi-academy trusts. And I guess the freedoms or the ability to adapt or choose, I guess I do feel that there's a discrepancy there that does need to be looked at, albeit that we have supported, maintained and academy schools with their flexible working practices. I think there is something there that does need further exploration.
Fantastic, and thanks so much for highlighting that work on diversity of teachers. I haven't brought up here, and I'm not sure we'll have time to get to it in the questions because there are so many others clustered around other topics. But as you say, the NFER have done phenomenal work, and Mission 44 as well, to look at diversity and how we improve the pipeline of ethnic minorities into teaching and where that's falling over. So I encourage people to go and have a look at that. All right, so Julie.
You completely agree on the importance of looking at diversity there. You know, I think there's a huge amount of talent that we lose from the system because we struggle to be as diverse as we should be. We struggle to be as flexible as we might be able to be. So yeah, I definitely think that is both part of the problem and part of the solution. To pick up on another couple of things there, James, and I think the kind of the chat that started to emerge there a little bit about kind of what do we mean by disadvantage, and how do we make sure that we get the best people that we need in front of children that most need it. I mean, I think that's a really challenging question in a system where, you know, we have people working in the system who have free will. So I think there's something there that we need to look at across the system about how we align incentives and getting incentives with getting the people, the most skilled people in front of those children that most need them. So I think there's something there around funding, very close to EPI's heart, but kind of disadvantaged funding and how we make that work. And I think, you know, we are increasingly interested at ASCL in a model that it would be sacrilege a few years ago, but actually looks at maybe moving a little bit away from per pupil funding models and recognizing that we have, you know, very extensive levels of complexity and disadvantage and needs across the system, and having a better baseline of that we then kind of weight towards disadvantage, I think is something we're really interested in seeing. I think the alignment there with how we incentivize both schools and individuals to behave through our accountability system. You know, at the moment, it feels like people, if they want to behave ethically and work in the most disadvantaged areas, they're almost kind of we're asking them to actively work against their own best interests there. So I think there's an alignment piece there. The question around multi-academy trusts and maintained schools and how we kind of make sure there's a level playing field. I mean, I think Jim alluded to this earlier, and Antonia as well. I think, you know, that what we really need, and I think in a lot of cases what we have is a system where there is professional generosity, and we're kind of recognizing that some schools and groups of schools have more capacity than others to do some of this hard thinking and hard lifting. And I think we are seeing a lot of sharing across the system of that. And I think that says an awful lot about, you know, who we are as a system and the people that work within it. And then just a final thought on that question around specialist teachers, and if they are few and far between in some subjects, which we know they are, how do we kind of spread that expertise across the system? And that's where I think, you know, there's real potential there for technology to help. You know, and there are some models we're starting to see emerge of that, where, you know, if you've got a brilliant physics teacher in this school and you know that lots of other schools are really struggling to get that expertise, people starting to move towards, is there a bit of a separation there of kind of pedagogical roles and pastoral roles? So you might be able to move towards almost a more kind of university lecture model for older students, where you can have that brilliant physics teacher broadcasting to a much wider group of students, but then their kind of pastoral needs or their other needs that aren't just about that specific subject knowledge are picked up on the ground. And I think we are starting to see some really interesting models emerging there. And frankly, we're going to have to see more of them, because all the modelling suggests we are not suddenly going to be inundated with brilliant physics teachers who can do that in every school. So yeah, some real kind of opportunities there, I think, to think about the workforce and think about the role of technology differently in order to address some of those big issues that we're starting to see in the system.
Julie, am I allowed to ask you to expand on that? Because I know we've got a few questions here, which I don't know we'll get to specifically for everyone, about the role of digital learning and how we should teach that. I know universities have been thinking for a long time about flipped classrooms, about larger broadcasts, but there's also been a concern that there are a lot of students now who are not really doing a lot of learning in higher education. and not attending much because they're watching lectures afterwards. How do you see these models working well in schools, and what's that emerging evidence you're hearing from your members?
I think that really depends on the age of the young person we're talking about. I think I certainly haven't seen and wouldn't necessarily expect to see models of very young people, young children, kind of where that broadcast model is working. And I think that's where there is a role for flipped learning here, I think, and I think there are some really interesting examples of that. I guess that's not really what I was talking about here. I think I was talking about something that's closer to a traditional model, which is the teacher kind of imparting their wisdom, but that potentially being able to find ways using technology for that to go out to a broader group of students, but not in the sense of they'd necessarily be kind of listening to that at home in their bedrooms, as I think a lot of students in HE are now. That there's the examples I've seen of that haven't been that at a school level. They have been still recognising that there are enormous amounts of benefit, particularly with all the concerns we have at the moment about behaviour and engagement, about having those young people physically in the school, in the classroom, with adults around them that can offer the support they need, but kind of literally piping in, I guess, that subject expertise that lots of schools are struggling to find.
Brilliant, thank you. Jim?
I mean, on that last point, internationally, I've seen some interesting examples. I mean, obviously, we're seeing the rise of the online school, and we got one or two here in the UK, and we got more overseas, and some of those are actually working fairly well, and they are not isolated sort of e-learning students. They are creating some kind of social aspect of the learning too. But I mean, there's a school in Oman, as an example, where they do a third of instructional teaching using adaptive learning platforms. A third is remote teaching from a live teacher coming in to class and with pastoral leads in the classroom, and then a third human teaching in the classroom. Now, that was done by necessity. What the people who run that school ended up doing is adopting some of that practice in their more viable school in the capital, in Muscat, so that they're now able to offer some A-level subjects that they weren't able to offer by engaging people who are resident in another country 5-6 hours a week to teach that remotely, who come and spend a little bit of time, for a week at the beginning or the end or whatever, to get to know the students, but are delivering remotely. I think we'll see more of that. More of that sort of practice, as you say, particularly for the older. But some of those online schools, a friend of mine runs one out of Berlin for elementary children, and is working really, really well. So there are innovators out there, and we should keep an eye on them. And indeed, University of Derby, as an example, they've now got a really good course in training teachers how to teach online. So some of the pedagogic practices also emerge. On the LA's question, look, I mean, I suppose if I had a magic wand, if I was back working in local authorities, I would want local authorities to be running their schools a bit more like MATs do. I also want MATs to have more local authority involvement in them as well. I think there's a meeting in the middle somewhere along the line. But if there is a problem that local authorities don't have the expertise in technology, they don't have the expertise in HR or wherever, you just ask the question, why not? They're getting the same amount of funding. Why don't they organize themselves better? Now, that doesn't mean that the MAT world shouldn't be helping out and shouldn't be passing on good practice, but you've still got to have a culture within the local authorities that want to adopt that good practice. John's question about resources being moved away from advantaged communities and kind of, isn't that unfair? In the end, I disagree with John on that, much as I love and respect him. I think, and within the MAT that I chair, we have a few schools, not many, were disproportionately disadvantaged, but a few in more advantaged shire counties, and they're not easy. What Michael Wilshaw, when he was chief inspector, talked about in terms of those sort of I can't remember the phrase that he used, but that sort of tolerance of mediocrity and the lack of ambition can exist in those sorts of communities. And that doesn't, so we do need to get really good teachers in all communities, not just in disadvantaged ones, but the challenges in educating people in concentrations of disadvantage are really significant, and they do require more resource. I do think it's really important that the funding formula, etc., recognise that. And finally, in terms of Joe's question that a few have commented on the diversity of leaders, I think it's really, really important that we celebrate those leaders from more diverse backgrounds who are in the system and highlight them more. We've been doing some work around that ADDIE Act, we've created a network around, I think, minority leaders and teachers more generally. I think we've got more work to do on teachers and leaders with disability. You know, there are other parts of diversity that are not heard from as much in this debate, but we've got a lot more to do. But along the way, let's celebrate what we do have.
Thanks, Jim. And I can see now that we are not going to get to all the questions in the Q&A. So I encourage panelists, if you have a moment, to go and have a look at those questions. You've got a type answer button there. And if there are some that you think you've got an answer to, please do put that in. So I'm sure Antonia has a lot to say about all these questions about classrooms as well. They're sitting very patiently there. I might not get a chance to say them. So please do dive in and put it in these questions here. And I can see John is very active in the chat as well. If there's things you want to respond to there, please do. All right, Caitlin, your thoughts?
It's more a question actually, following Jim's comment about the international schools that you're aware of. It was more just in just thinking, what can we learn from education systems internationally around kind of curriculum, around teacher development, around recruitment, retention issues more widely? I mean, I'm just, yeah, very, very intrigued to hear more on the international angle.
I mean, Caitlin, the most important thing to learn from international examples is we don't have to do things the way we've always done them here, because there are plenty of people doing them differently elsewhere. So, you know, we're not trapped. We can choose to do things differently. And indeed, actually, whilst it feels like the amount of regulation and inspection, etc., especially in secondary, and I think, you know, back to where we started the whole conversation about, you know, these factors in James's slide deck are much more profound in secondary. I think that is because of, in some part, because of more regulation, inspection and testing at secondary. But even within all of those constraints, there are places where the rules don't apply and where you can do things differently and where you can take some risks and you can experiment and explore things and draw on what's happening in other jurisdictions. Some of those are government jurisdictions. I tend to spend quite a lot of time in the international school community. Now they have the privilege of being private schools, so they don't have very much regulation, but you do find interesting examples of innovation. There are a few independent schools here in the UK, you know, Bedales, Atlantic College out in Wales, who, you know, one or two others who are doing really interesting, innovative work that we can go and see here in the UK. But there is a range of different fee levels in the international school sector. So you can see differently funded environments still doing very interesting, innovative work. And that's one of the things I love about getting involved in that sector is to see some of that. And then I also see really, really privileged schools who are charging really, really eye-watering amounts of money. But even there, you can see some really interesting choices that they're making, and they are getting the support of parents who are willing to pay a large amount of money for things being done very differently to the way they're being done in our state-maintained schools here, and not just because of resource.
Yeah, and how do we share that? I mean, how are we all sharing that currently? Obviously, I mentioned in my opening remarks around kind of webinars and obviously getting papers out there and publicizing as much as possible. But how kind of, I mean, do private schools share maintained schools, Mats?
Yeah. I think that's one for James. You know, it's a piece of work for you, James.
Yeah.
There's lots to do on this, isn't there? But I think, you know, this convening is part of it, isn't it? And then I think there's a huge amount of work going on across the sector with all sorts of bodies who are looking for best examples overseas, bringing it back people like Jim who are working overseas, bringing that back to their work in England. So I agree with everything he said. I just don't think we're terrible at it in England, and we shouldn't talk ourselves down. But I think we're getting to our last 10 minutes now. So we're going to go for our final round of questions. And I can see we've got a few questions here about the DfE. How does ITT need to adapt? And obviously the DfE heavily regulates what's done in ITT, so I think that's really a central question. Does the DfE have the resources to develop the sort of guidance and MPQs Nicola's asking? So I think there's a few questions here as well about what it is DfE should be doing. And we probably all know that there is a school white paper coming in a few months' time. There's probably a SEND white paper coming in a few months' time as well. I'm not entirely sure if they're the same paper or they're different papers or if that's entirely certain yet. But there are these white papers coming. So what I want each panelist to reflect on are two things, and you will only have 1.5 minutes each to do this. You don't have to write down too much, Jim. It's quite straightforward. Number one, what thing do you want to see in the white paper? And number two, what thing are you worried you might see that you do not want to see in the white paper?
How do you want to start?
Well, I was giving everyone a moment just to reflect there before I picked on someone. I thought that would be very unfair. So, in case anyone has something that's come to mind, does anyone want to volunteer to go first here? Oh, Caitlin,
No,
sorry,
I was just going to
Caitlin.
say what I'd like to see is kind of more innovation and that view of being able to, and obviously I would say this from a business perspective, but being able to engage with wider stakeholders, whether that be obviously school leaders, boards, trusts, business policy shapers. I think just ultimately that collaborative kind of a more bold action to get input and engagement from the multiple voices in the sector, and an early engagement when considering where funding's going to go is what I'd like to see. I'd have to reflect on what I wouldn't want to see. So
and is there any one innovation you want to see, Caitlin, that you think you would have told this is the one if they'd asked you, which I'm sure they have?
Oh golly, quite a few, I guess. I guess it's just being able to look more holistically at the processes that we have in place, and being able to again look at the kind of technologies that we have at hand, particularly around I guess obviously, as I mentioned, recruitment, but also around the kind of inclusion within classrooms and EHCPs. We haven't really dwelled on that from a special educational needs perspective, but actually, is there a way we can look at using technology to really gather data quickly and move that through? But that's just on the top, as you asked, on the top of my head. But yeah, just more engagement and kind of early engagement.
Thanks, Caitlin. Jim, you were very enthusiastic before. Do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'm happy to go next. Look, the most important thing is that we have a really clear vision from the Secretary of State and her team as to what school is for in a post-industrial age and in the age of AI, of longevity, of some of the sorts of things we've been talking about today. I think it does need to change. It does need to reflect that. We'll see with the outcome of the curriculum and assessment review that will need to be embedded within the white paper, and that will give us an indication as to some of that change, but there'll be some other consequentials as well. I would also like to see government set out what it's going to stop asking schools to do. If we want the innovation that Caitlin rightly talks about, we've got to remove some of the constraints, and we've got to give more trust to school teachers and to their leaders to use their professional judgment and treat them more professionally, which in turn requires, I think, it requires all the issues in Ofsted to be resolved to get the cultural change to actually happen. I think we're a long way from that still. I think we need to see Ofsted inspection of MATs happen as quickly as we can. I think that is fairly urgent to see some rationalisation of the inspection regime, and it's obviously incredibly important that we get this SEND issue resolved properly and quickly and properly resourced, but taking, if at all possible, taking the heat out of it, so it's not about parents clamoring for a particular status for their children, because that brings a certain amount of resource, but we have we have a more of a rational approach to it, where in the end we can deal with every child's individual needs, and maybe AI can help us a little bit with that too.
Brilliant, thanks, Jim. I'll just bring people's attention to the Q&A and the chat as well. I can see lots of great stuff going on in the chat. Ruth from the Nuffield Foundation pushing this great new centre they've funded, which is going to look more international. I think that's explicitly the point of it. And then some other chat from Joe about the BET show as well, and some questions I think in there for Julie. So I don't know if you want to jump in there, Julie, and maybe we'll turn to Antonia.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't think I've seen the specific questions, but I shall answer your question first, James, and then maybe come back to those. I mean, I think probably going to be quite a lot of agreement here on what we want to see in that white paper. Completely agree that that need for a clear vision. You know, I think the government is doing some really good stuff, but I think it's getting a bit stymied by the fact that it's difficult for people to see where that good stuff fits into the overall vision. And I think sometimes they set hares running in a way that they don't need to if they'd just been a bit clear about what the purpose of what that particular policy is. So clear vision that, linked to my opening remarks, sets out really clearly what do we expect of schools, and what do we not expect of schools, and how does this link with wider government and wider services. I'd like to see a really clear exposition of their recruitment and retention strategy. Again, I think there's some good work going on there, but at the moment it feels a little bit like we have this target of 6,500 teachers and a bit of a vacuum about how we're actually going to get there. So a bit more on that would be good. Completely agree around the SEND reform point, and I really hope those two things are brought together into a single paper, because I think part of the problem is that we are thinking about them separately. You know, we're in a place now where almost half of children and young people are identified as having some form of additional need during their school career. You have to get to a point where you start to ask, you know, what is a special need and what is actually just a mainstream need. So I think bringing those two things together would be really helpful. What I don't want to see, I don't want to see too much rehashing of old arguments, and I don't want to see too much micromanagement or focus on ministerial priorities that may not necessarily be the priorities across the system.
Thank you, Julie. And finally, Antonia.
Okay, I'll be quick. So I completely agree. The main thing that I want to see is what the vision is, and I want to see coherence between the different parts of the vision, because we've had a number of different policy announcements, and it's not clear how those things are coherently working as a big whole, if that makes sense. You know, from my perspective, all the things that we've spoken about here in terms of SEND, inclusion, digital, and things like that are things that I'd like to see. Because this is about workforce management, I know that the new STPCD will include reference to flexible working within it, and some progress, you know, around flexible working. I would like to see a much more thorough revision of the STPCD, because I don't think it reflects how our teachers work today. And I think that needs to be looked at more holistically. So that's something that I think is important. And just going back to Jim's point about MAT inspections, yes, I think that MATs should be inspected. I think that the layers of accountability for MATs are many and varied, and I would like to see a streamlining of the bureaucracy around that, matched with a nuanced and thoughtful and ethical framework for the inspection of MATs that won't duplicate what's already happening, but also means that the right people are inspecting MATs from a position of knowledge of what MAT leadership should or shouldn't look like, if that makes sense. So I think that, yeah, I'd like to see all the things. I'd like to see the vision. I'd like to see the coherence between of it all. I think that there's a place for the STPCD to be re-looked at, because I don't know that it's fit for purpose anymore, and there are areas of that can be improved upon. And I agree, MATs do need to be inspected, but within an ethical regulatory framework that is nuanced and thoughtful and sensitive and intelligent.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Antonia. And I think we've reached time now, bang on time. Thank you so much to all the panelists. I learned so much today. Thank you particularly to Caitlin and Capita for making this possible. Obviously, this is not the last word on any of this. These are ongoing conversations among all our organizations. EPI is going to keep working on this. Capita and all our panelists I know are working on this all the time. And it's phenomenal to see so many deep experts in the chat and online here as well, who I know are working on these issues. As everyone seems to agree, though, that what we need right now is a vision, but a vision that brings these different issues together. So it's not simply asking schools to do more with less, but creating a way for schools to achieve their core goal of supporting all pupils with the resources that we realistically have. And let's hope that all working together, we can get there. Thank you all so much for coming along. I'll bring that to a close now.